Welcome to the Lenders Digest podcast, hosted by Jonathan Preston. Please subscribe at lendersdigest.substack.com. So today I want to talk about a concept that I've been thinking about, which is where you can actually sell your business's equity twice if you're self-employed. So I have a bit of a background around this, so bear with me as I explain the concept, and I'll bring it back to a local scenario. So I originally discovered this by looking at the tokens that crypto exchanges issued. And these generally are supposed to receive a fixed percentage of the revenue of the business. And so if you remember FTX, which was the big story recently, which recently went under, before the crash, they had a token called FTT. And that was, I believe, entitled to 30% of the actual revenue. So in a way, this was kind of like a franchise fee where it receives a fixed percentage of revenue. Now, this structure is not completely unheard of. For example, I heard that Fortescue Metals used to have financing where the financier received a percentage of the revenue, and that was before they actually paid the debt out. So in that example, the lender received part of the revenue upfront, and then the Fortescue equity holders received the remainder. And so in the FTX example, the FTT tokens had the right to the first 30% of revenue, which was then used to buy back those same tokens on the market and burn them. So it would effectively reduce the supply, and then that would, encourage the potential growth in the value of those because there's less on the market, and as more revenue would come in, that would in turn, reduce the supply further. So that was the idea. But if we separate that, after the first 30% of revenue, the remaining 70% of revenue would still go to equity holders. And then on top of that, FTX would sell that equity again. So they would effectively be doing capital raisings just like any other business. And so I think this is quite interesting because if we forget about the tokens and everything for a minute, effectively they sold the equity twice. So the first was, a fixed share of revenue, and that was sold as a token. And then secondly, the equity, which was then, the owner of the remainder of the revenue. And so I'm not quite sure why this hasn't been discussed in more detail by other people in finance, and perhaps it has been, but it seems to me they sort of unlocked a way of sort of selling the equity twice. And so this has been resting in the back of my mind for some years now. And I was recently thinking of a local example, which is, let's say you establish a couple of gyms. So for this example, we'll call it like Jonathan's Fitness. So let's say I establish 3 gyms. Let's say they're profitable. They've got plenty of revenue. Then what you'd potentially do is you'd be setting up a franchise system, and the gyms would say pay a percentage of the revenue or profit, to the master franchise holder, which also happens to be your other business. And then what you would do is you'd go out and sell the 3 gyms on the market, with you still being there as the master franchisor, and then you would still receive your part of the ongoing revenue still. And then after you've sold those gyms, you would then later sell the master franchise agreement as well. So in theory, you've sort of sold the equity twice. Now, it is questionable about how much extra you'd get if you sold it in 2 parts as opposed to selling one. But in this case, in this example, you can sort of see that, there is a potential opportunity. And in some cases, you might be able to find a way, sell these for higher profitability. So for example, like the franchise part is going to be, potentially high income with low expenses. But then, of course, the gyms are going to be sort of the lower margin because they have to pay the franchise fee. So it does change the dynamics of it, but the concept remains. And so while this isn't directly property related, I thought it was an interesting idea that some people who are running businesses might find potentially useful. And another sort of example is some years back, I met the actual founder of Aportos, and my understanding was that he sold Aportos, but he retained basically a business which sold food supplies to Aportos, like, the lettuce and stuff like that. And so that way the idea was that he'd be able to sell out of the Aportos group, get the big payday, but still be able to have a way of receiving that ongoing income from the business because they were committed to buy the supplies through him. So I'm sure there are many other examples also, but I just wanted to share that one today. And please do stay tuned for future episodes. It would mean a lot to me if you'd consider leaving a 5-star review. And please, again, jump onto the newsletter, Lenders Digest. Substack.com is where you need to go. Again, it's Jonathan Preston, and I really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you.